In the previous presentation, we reviewed the SPS and TBT agreements. You would have noted that food safety for the purposes of the safety of the health of consumers was covered by Codex. Now I would like to explain what is Codex, what is the history, what is the mandate of Codex, what is its use in a national food control system for the protection of health of consumers, both through domestic production and imports, and how it is linked to trade, and of course its linkage with the WTO. Let's understand the history first. Codex Alimentarius Commission was set up in 1963. The whole thing started several years before 1963. Different countries, different groups of countries, for example, Latin American countries, European countries, they were setting standards for facilitating trade within the region. Subsequently, FAO and WHO realized that why should there be standards for regional trade? After all, there is global trade in food products. So why not have a global body? The Food and Agriculture Organization, which is based in Rome, the World Health Organization, which is based in Geneva, they discussed this amongst themselves. The process started in 1961. The formal process of creating Codex Alimentarius Commission was started in 1961 with FAO, and then finally during the World Health Assembly session in May 1963, WHO also agreed with the proposal for setting up this international body, and they called it Codex Alimentarius Commission. Codex Alimentarius means the food code. So it's an international intergovernmental body. International because FAO and WHO are bodies of the United Nations. So it's an international body. And since countries are members of FAO and WHO, it's an intergovernmental body. It is the members which are countries who agree on setting standards. Codex Alimentarius, therefore, is a collection of standards, guidelines, and codes of practice for ensuring standards. So first there is a standard, then there are guidelines for certain practices. For example, if one country wants to set up a national food control system, there is a guideline for that. If two trading partners want to agree on conformity assessment procedures or to review the food safety measures, then there is an equivalence arrangement. So what process should be followed for an equivalence agreement? There are guidelines for that. And codes of practice, for example, if you want to control aflatoxin contamination in peanuts or milk or cereals, or you want to control microbiological contamination in vegetables, what practice should be followed to ensure that you are within the levels prescribed by the Codex Alimentarius standards? These are codes of practice. So the mandate, therefore, which flows from the SPS agreement, which we studied in the previous presentation, is to ensure the protection of the health of consumers, and while doing so, ensure that there are fair practices in food trade. There is no fraudulent practice. There is a uniform practice. There is no disguised barrier to trade. There is transparency in setting standards. All these things are a part of fair practices in food trade. So whatever work is done by the Codex Alimentarius Commission is aimed at the two mandates: the health of consumers, protection of the health of consumers, and ensuring fair practices in food trade. This work is carried out through a coordinated effort by all the countries that are members. Any country which is a member of FAO or WHO has a right to become a member of Codex. So all the countries, they sit together and frame the standards. However, to make it more transparent, to make it more acceptable as an international standard, other organizations which are non-governmental organizations of international level have been inducted into the Codex as observers. But standards are still set by the members and not by the observers. Observers have a right to give their views when the standard setting discussion is taking place, but they do not have a right to vote in the event there has to be a vote. Therefore, standards are set by the countries. Now, what are the activities involved? The first one, because SPS agreement says that standards have to be science-based, so there is a system of providing scientific advice through expert bodies to the Codex Alimentarius Commission for setting the standards. These expert bodies are established by FAO and WHO, and I will explain that later. The other activity is to elaborate the food standards. After taking into account the scientific advice provided by these expert bodies and expert meetings of FAO and WHO, the food standards are set by the Codex Alimentarius Commission. And the third one is to build capacity of countries, particularly the developing countries and the least developed countries, to strengthen their food control systems based on international standards, because international standards is the very basis of facilitating trade. So these are the three main activities of the Codex Alimentarius. 99% of the world population is covered by Codex. There are 188 members today. 187 countries are members of Codex, plus one member organization, which is the European Union. So there can be a member organization which can be a part of the Codex Alimentarius. There is only one member organization. But in terms of number of countries, there are 187 countries that are members of Codex. 99% of the world population is covered. Therefore, whatever standards are set by Codex are truly global standards, and that help to protect the health of consumers and facilitate trade. Now, what is the importance of Codex in a national food control system? Supposing a country does not have a national food control system, and if a situation comes that exports decline and imports increase, there could be substandard food products that are produced because of the absence of a national food control system, and therefore substandard food products will get imported also. And if the national food control system does not allow use of international standards, or there is no national food control system in a country, then the country will not be able to export to other countries because of the SPS measures of the importing country. So in both these situations, what happens? It is the domestic market that suffers. And if the domestic market suffers, what is the result? The result is hunger. The result is wastage of food. There is poverty. There is less nutrition available for the people. Substandard food products will get imported. Less exports and limited global negotiating power. Less tourists, nobody will come if there is no food control system. And eventually there will be a negative trade balance, and that is bad for the economy. All this in a combined manner is bad for the economy of any country. Therefore, a national food control system is of critical importance. And if Codex standards are there, then you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So therefore, the solution lies in adopting a policy for food safety, any country for that matter, taking a strategic approach, setting up a regulatory mechanism. India has done all that. India has a policy for food safety. India has a regulatory mechanism, the Food Safety Authority of India, and there is a strategic approach, both regulatory and promotional and developmental. And therefore, if regulatory mechanism has to be kept updated, it is important to keep in touch with the international developments, whether it is Codex, OIE or IPPC. But here we are talking in terms of Codex. Whatever international developments are taking place, for example in Codex, India has to keep itself updated, and that is what India does, and that applies to any country. And then make use of the international standards. If you do not make use of the international standards, you have to carry out a scientific risk assessment, which is quite expensive. And if this work has been done by the international standard setting body, one doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. So you make use of the international standards and then set up food safety infrastructure. Laboratories have to be set up with the right equipment. You need to have appropriate people to set the work of the laboratories. So therefore, the solution lies in taking a policy approach and a strategic manner to carry out the work of setting up of a national food control system and then set up the regulatory mechanism. Every country has to do that. Every country does that. Countries that have not done it are in the process of doing that. India has adopted a policy for food safety. India has a strategic approach, which I shall explain, and a regulatory mechanism has been set up by setting up the Food Safety and Standards Authority of India. Since the Food Safety and Standards Authority of India sets standards, it has to keep itself updated with whatever international developments are taking place, particularly Codex, in the context of food safety. And then make use of the international standards, that is Codex standards. Any country which has to set standards should either carry out a scientific risk assessment and provide data to the trading partners, or follow the international standards, because the work of risk assessment, scientific risk assessment, has already been carried out by Codex, FAO and WHO. So there is no need to reinvent the wheel. Then a food safety infrastructure has to be set up. For example, laboratories, testing protocols, have the people who are food analysts, who understand analysis, who understand validation. There have to be experts, and therefore it is extremely important for any country to invest in training. FSSAI also invests in training. Training of food business operators, training of food safety officers, training of inspectors, training of laboratory people, and this presentation is also a part of the training process to develop capacity in the country for implementing the policy for food safety. And therefore, it's important to remain in touch with Codex and understand what Codex is all about. And that is what I am presenting in this presentation. Now, why Codex? What is its relevance? How does it work? What are its achievements? It's very interesting to note. When Codex Alimentarius was set up in 1963, there were only 30 countries that were members of Codex. Most of them were developed countries. Now, there are 187 countries that are members, plus the European Union. At that time, there were 16 international non-governmental organizations that were members of Codex, and even governmental organizations. And now there are 234 observers. The budget has increased from $55,000 to $8.8 million for the 2014-15 biennium. The work started from milk standards, and now there are several Codex committees, both for vertical and horizontal standards. There is a procedural manual which has evolved over time, and a very strong Codex secretariat based in Rome with people who work day and night. FAO and WHO teams also provide support, not just in terms of people but also funding support. The entire process of Codex work is collaborative. All countries work together, inclusive. It's a transparent process. And all the risk assessment activities are based on certain principles, the working principles of risk analysis, part of the procedural manual. There are concerns for legitimate factors. And during the 90s, when WTO Uruguay round was concluded, the SPS agreement realized that Codex standards should be the reference standards in all dispute settlement procedures. And therefore, Codex text became a reference point in WTO. It is mentioned in the SPS agreement. Then, capacity building, the Codex Trust Fund, co-hosting, e-working groups, all these are a part of capacity building programs which have been done by Codex, which have evolved over time. And as I said in the previous slide, there were 30 countries and now there are 187 countries. 66 to 70% of the world population lives in the developing world. So there is a big contribution of the developing countries in setting international standards, the Codex standards, and therefore Codex is truly a global body for international standards for food safety. How does it work? It adopts standards based on science, as I said. It follows an inclusive, transparent and consensus-based process, and the entire process is based on the procedural manual which is called the Green Book, which is there on the Codex website, and the entire aim of all Codex activities is to ensure the safety of the health of consumers and ensuring fair practices in food trade, which is a twin mandate of Codex. What is the relevance of Codex to members? Based on scientific principles, risk analysis, consensus based, therefore it is a truly global body. It covers a wide range: product standards, codes of practice, guidelines, methods of analysis, maximum residue limits of pesticide, veterinary drugs, contaminants. What should be the audit procedures for facilitating trade? What is the code of ethics? How equivalence agreements should take place? What are the requirements which should form a part of the equivalence determination process? All this is there, which help both the exporting and the importing trading partners come to a level playing field. And it is easy to harmonize. If any country wants to set its standards, you align with Codex, you review the Codex standards and set the standards after taking into account the conditions in your country. India has done that. There is a presentation on harmonization, which I will explain how India did it. Then it provides flexibility. Exchange of information is standardized between the exporting country and the importing country, and therefore it saves time and facilitates trade. And if there is a difference of opinion, it helps to settle differences between the trading partners. And it is a reference standard in WTO. So if you can't settle differences outside WTO, WTO will take the reference standards, which are Codex standards, into account and settle the disputes. I gave you the example of sardines in the previous presentation, but there are other cases of biotech products, hormones, certificate of origin labeling. All these things have been discussed in dispute settlement bodies, and countries have aligned their SPS measures in line with the Codex standards. Just to give you some examples of the work done by Codex, and it is relevant to the developing countries. Standards for mycotoxins, that ochratoxins, melamine, I told you about the problem in China, dioxins, heavy metals, pesticide residues, veterinary drugs, GSFA, general standards for food additives, codes of practice for control of viruses in food, how to set up a national food control system, how do you carry out audit and assessment with their trading partner, how do you carry out the equivalence determination, what are the principles of risk analysis, countries can use that, GM and nutrition labeling, methods of analysis, and several commodity standards, whether it is for fresh fruits and vegetables, or processed fruits and vegetables, or fats and oils, fish and fishery products, meat and meat products, cereals, pulses and legumes, chocolates, mineral water. All these standards have been set by Codex, and these are very relevant to the developing countries. And therefore, Codex is extremely important for countries to use in a strategic manner and set their level of protection for the health of consumers of their own country, and also from the angle of imports. Thank you.